Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Especially want to acknowledge that people are taking some time for their mental health the day after World Mental Health Day yesterday. So we greatly appreciate that. Thank you for joining us for the Staying Grounded During the Election Season webinar. I'm Emily Clear. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm the Director of Adult Psychotherapy Services here at the Family Institute at Northwestern. We are a unique relationship-based behavioral and mental health organization that is committed to strengthening and healing children, adolescents, families, individuals from all walks of life. And we ground that through our research, our education, and our clinical therapy practice. I have the privilege today of being joined by three of our amazing staff therapists within our staff clinical practice. Joining me today from our adult trauma team is Leon Abbey. Leanne, do you want to take a moment to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Emily. Yeah, my name is Leon Abbey. Been with the adult trauma team for a couple of months here at the Family Institute, and looking forward to answering and dialoguing with some of the questions that you have.
Great. Thanks, Leon. And then I also have two fantastic members of our emerging adult team, Kaylin Cobb. Kaylin, you want to take a moment and introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Kaylin. My pronouns are she, her. I've been at the Family Institute also for a couple of months now, and I'm excited to get into the conversation today.
Great. Thanks, Kaylin. And last is Laura Canapaloo. Hopefully I'm saying it right. I feel like I did. Yay! Laura, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure, you got it right, Emily. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Canaplu. I use they, them pronouns. I too am excited. I've been at the Family Institute for a couple of months. It's actually 6 months now, which is wonderful. And I'm excited to answer some questions, have a dialogue with all the folks here today. It's a great group, so I'm excited.
Great. So let's dive into it. I kind of want to kick off our conversation today by acknowledging something that in preparation for this, I believe four of us, there's four of us, I got to include myself in this count. The four of us were talking about that there has been something unique over the past three presidential election cycles, but there's a lot of election cycles that have happened in between that has made it feel uniquely intense for a lot of clients. Why is it so difficult, do you all feel, for some of your clients and people in general to stay grounded during this election season? And I'm going to use the word calm, but I also recognize calm may not be achievable. So just grounding in a place that feels adaptive for them. Why do you guys feel like it's so difficult? Who wants to jump in first?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think I want to share from a more biological neuroscience approach, but I think there's something called neuroception, right? It's a part of our nervous system, built-in surveillance system to scan cues in the environment for whether we feel safe and connected, whether we're in danger. And it's those states that often, if we don't transition well into, we can feel easily like we have to protect ourselves. Like there's a survival strategy that we have to use to defend or to confront or even maybe avoid certain situations, like discussing political situations altogether. And so I think that people have a hard time calming and grounding themselves because there's a fight or flight response. And so, and that's automatic. It's impulse. Sometimes we can, it leads to impulsive decision making, aggression, anxiety, worry, when we feel like something is threatening us.
That's a really helpful context, Leon, to kind of kick off our conversation, because I think a lot of what we're going to be sharing today is like some tips and strategies to help yourself stay a little more neurologically and emotionally regulated. So that's a really helpful context. Laura and Kaylin, any thoughts on your ends about what's making it particularly difficult?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Leanna's saying. And there's also a level of like uncertainty during this election period. And if we don't have either the skills to navigate that uncertainty or the community to support us, through it, I think our emotions can get heightened and contribute to feelings of stress and anxiety. And I think around the election season in general, not just these particular last three, it can often also kind of be like New Year's Eve, where people have time to reflect on like past goals and either their progress or lack of progress towards those goals, both as individuals and I think also as a collective. And so there can be heightened emotions. There can be some guilt, some anger, frustration, disappointment, sadness, and fear that we're navigating, I think, again, both as individuals and as a collective.
That's a great context to put it into, to that recognition that this is a time marker and a benchmark, and there is some collective as well as individual. Laura, for you?
I just want to piggyback off of a word that Kaylin just said is community, and not to bring up an even harder time was quarantine, and obviously COVID is still existing, but I think when we think about these, past few elections specifically, the last one is like to find our community again in this, quote unquote, post-COVID world. It can feel even more challenging as someone, identifies as non-binary and trans and queer. Sometimes when we're navigating and we want to speak to people who have, kind of shared identities, I speak about this and think about this a lot with my clients because me and my clients have a lot of shared identities. And I hear a lot of like, how do I find my community? How do I find my community in this post-pandemic, use air quotes post-pandemic because we're, well, still in COVID. Staying grounded can feel really tough when navigating something as big as an election. So finding those spaces and places to feel like I can talk freely. I can talk freely.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really important piece. So how do you help your clients find that? Like what are you doing to help them find and foster a sense of community? And what other kind of techniques are you bringing into the clinical spaces to help people manage their stress through the election cycle?
Yeah, for me, I think it's a lot of like checking in with self, and figuring out what are we experiencing that exists in the context of this election season, but also what are some things that have already been there and like might be heightened. I think there are a lot of um, triggers of stress and anxiety that are spoken to in the election season. So whether that's work pressure, issues with finances, health concerns, relationship problems, a lot of that can often be highlighted, I think, in different like policies and different structures. And so folks are already feeling some of this, and it gets heightened when we come to this season. And I think one, checking in with self, doing some different grounding techniques, and also realizing like what we have emotional capacity to deal with and what we don't. And it's okay to, we'll get into this more a little bit later, but it's okay to create boundaries around these conversations that you're having with individuals.
Absolutely. I think you're also speaking to something that's really critical too, right? Like that identification of like what's happening inside of me and like what is getting activated when I'm hearing conversations about this election, when I'm hearing topics about this election. And that stepping back and identifying like what parts of this do I have control over versus I find like sometimes it's helpful for clients to identify the ways that they don't have control over some of the situations, right? And then kind of tipping or leaning them into the ways they do, right? Like what is activating some of this stress for you? Can you go campaign? Can you go help an organization that has a shared, like you were naming, Laura, like a community and value system to you in a way that's like directing that anxious energy towards something that feels like, okay, I'm contributing, I'm helping. What other ways? Oh, go ahead, Leanne.
Oh, something else that I'd like to add, and I think you mentioned this, Emily, but be able to notice and monitor and be curious about what are the sensations that are occurring in my body, how that may be connected to how emotionally I'm being triggered, right? This also can be connected to my belief systems. My belief systems often inform, obviously, my values. And so all of these are steeped into emotions that can be triggering. If there's a policy or a candidate that violates or threatens, right, that belief system, that philosophy, that worldview, that can also obviously trigger some of the emotional or physiological reactions.
Yeah, that's really key. I'm curious if you guys are seeing, like, how are you helping clients manage this? Like, we're talking kind of more this like external system, right? Like the candidates or what they're hearing in the news cycles related to it. What are you hearing or experiencing with clients in terms of triggers that are happening within their own family system? Like, I'm particularly thinking, Kaylin and Laura, you guys work with a lot of emerging adults, right? Like, this is the first time they're voting, and they may hold a very different set of belief system than maybe their parents or their grandparents or aunts and uncles. What are you seeing come up for them in those spaces and in those different relationship dynamics, and how do you help them navigate them? Laura, maybe I'll toss it. Oh, Kaylin, go.
Yeah.
I saw you come off mute. Go, Kaylin. Go. Or you're go. Okay, Laura, we're going to Laura.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question because I think I don't want to sound like I'm aging myself because I'm still super young, but I do see, I mean, emerging adults are, a lot of my clients are in their early 20s. And I think that we are seeing um, a lot because I think social media is still a new thing, even though it feels like maybe it's been forever. But we are seeing a younger generation be so involved.
Mhm.
And now with, clients that I have, like there are um, different views, whether it's about a candidate or not, just like different views from what their parents have. Someone like me, it's like, oh, maybe you just kind of followed what your parents did or what your teacher said. And now we have these younger folks just being like, no, I was reading this, or I was looking at this, or I was watching this video, and they're able to maybe think more critically, not because, they're smarter or whatnot. There's just more access. There's so much more access than perhaps someone who's 38 had. I still have the internet, but just different access at your fingertips all the time. And then that's also going to get me on a whole other topic of access.
Mm.
And I think, what I'm hearing from my clients is that sometimes we have to disengage, right? Sometimes it's like, I go back to my schooling of, being in social work. It's like, is this person, if it's a family member, whether it's mom, dad, cousin, sister, uncle, are you likely to educate the person or people that you're engaging with? Are you likely to be effective with the message in the conversation that you want to come across in? And at what point do you go, today's not the day?
Mm.
Today's not the day. I'm hungry. I'm tired. I haven't had my coffee. Dad and or mom and or parent or caregiver want to have a nice conversation about something. And historically, we do not agree on this
Mm.
topic. And I need to disengage. And that also can be hard on the other person. And what I talk to my clients about is we can only control our own emotions, right?
Mm.
We can only control, you know what, today, this morning on this phone call, I know in the past we've had this conversation. I'd actually like to put a pin in it today.
Mm.
Creating those boundaries, right? A boundary is supposed to be helpful for both people. It's not to punish someone, it's not to exile someone, it's to hopefully create a safe space for both people to go, it's okay. Today I'm not going to engage. Or someone, for the foreseeable future, I don't want to engage in this because I'm protecting myself. And in that way, also maybe protecting you because I want to keep and preserve this relationship.
That's great. Caitlin, do you have guidance when you're helping clients determine when the time is for a boundary? Like Laura's naming some really good examples of boundaries. Like, is there something you work with clients in particular to help them identify when it's a good time to set a boundary with family and or other people? I can imagine work could be another space too, friends.
Yeah. I loved what Leon was saying earlier about like checking in with your body and different body sensations. I think our bodies often have a level of wisdom that we've been kind of trained to ignore. And so a lot of my work, especially when first meeting with clients, is establishing an understanding of like, I love a good emotions wheel, and I will pull up the emotions wheel, and then I will also connect that to like what sensation comes up for you when we say angry? What sensation comes up for you when you're saying sadness, so that they're able to start recognizing in themselves what these different emotions feel like. From that point, we're able to establish a baseline of, okay, like now that we have an understanding of what some fear feels like in your body, when you are talking with this person, when you are experiencing this interaction, I've noticed that you say that you feel some like tension in your chest, or I feel some strain coming in my throat. Okay, well, perhaps that is information for us that something about this interaction needs to have changed. From that point, talking with a client about what made you feel uncomfortable in this situation, what made that sensation come up, what is something that would help you maintain this relationship, but also help you feel safe in this conversation. And I think as we are talking about having these difficult conversations with families, with friends, with sometimes even coworkers, um, establishing, is this a safe place for me to have this conversation? And I think part of that is also understanding, why are we having this conversation? Are we having it to educate? Are we having it just to kind of share our point of view? Yeah, are we just having it to vent? I think if we can be clear about what we're hoping from this conversation, that can increase safety in folks, and you are more able to have a boundary conversation.
Yeah, and I love that too, because that extends well past the election cycle, right? This helps people identify like, why am I staying in this dialogue with this particular family member? And, the election cycle is going to happen early November, and then people are going to gather for Thanksgiving, right? And so I love that guidance of like, why are we having this conversation? What is happening to my body when I think about this conversation? What's coming up for me? And I think, again, like you guys were naming, like this difference in values, right? Like we do know the younger generation has a different way of organizing around values than some of the older generations, right? And so like, how am I going to stay connected to this person who's important to me when maybe our value systems aren't totally shared? So this feels like an important, like we had a lot of pre-webinar questions regarding like, how do we help kids during this election cycle, like younger children? Like, are there things that you talk to with your clients about like how to help kids manage their own anxiety in the election cycle and just helping them stay grounded during this time? And I'm curious to hear from all of you, especially Laura has a school background. Leon, you're a parent. So, like, what are you guys helping, or how are you helping clients navigate talking to children about who may have anxiety around the election cycle?
I can go. As Emily said, I have a school background. I worked at a high school in Brooklyn, ages 14 to 18. So some of them at some point were going to be able to vote, but for the most part, not able to vote. And so not only was I working with my students, I was working with the families, and I worked during, an election season. Um, during the height of COVID, during a lot of very politically driven times. Um, and what me and other social workers did and teachers tried to do was, for the students, create as many safe spaces as possible. But when working with the parents, I mean, you hear it time and time and time and again, limit um, phone usage. But what does that look like, right? Sure, you can put a timer on it, et cetera, but also talking about it, right? Because what I talked about before is access. And access has just become so constant, with every single app, with TikTok messaging, just constant, videos, Instagram. I don't believe children are using Facebook, but there is access to Facebook. I don't think kids are using Twitter/X, but they might be, you know, there's just so YouTube, everything is in their face all the time. So even when, you know, children might be upset that there's a limit to their access, talking to them about how and why we're limiting it, and also maybe putting a limit on what they're viewing, right? I was thinking about this earlier, and that like social media might bring them joy. And there are ways in which you can curate or go, you know, on and curate their feed, you know, on different apps, their feed with them of things that might bring them joy. Because right now, I feel like, especially with our teens, it's going to be inundated and inundated and inundated. And not just with, you know, one candidate or another, but with so many things going on around the world that also might often feel scary. And maybe they want to talk about it, sure, but maybe they don't know how to talk about it. So, of course, keeping an open space. I know I worked really hard with our teachers to create those spaces. So, you know, that's also really hard on teachers, and then creating spaces for our adults as well. But it can be hard because I know a teenager and a preteen is going to go, I can't believe you're limiting my time. But speaking about why we're limiting time, because there is so much access, and perhaps curating what they might be seeing and showing, hey, let's curate some joy in our screen time. Let's curate some, you know, if it's music or something that will create a space, and not to shield them, but to take some of it a little bit. I like to call it like retreating, right? Let's retreat to a place that is a little bit away from a space that feels hard to digest all the
Yeah.
time.
Goes back to those boundaries, right? Like that's
Exactly.
also a nice opportunity to talk to children about the algorithms, right? That you are not like the content is getting pushed on you based on what you're interacting with. And so I think it's always a good like teaching moment as a parent. This is why you're getting this information. Let's talk about the information. Are you viewing all sides of the information, right? And I think especially I'm thinking about adolescent boys, but also adolescent girls in other contexts, right? Like what is getting fed to you, and you know, just thinking globally about different groups that kind of take advantage of young adolescent men and what kind of content they're pushing towards them. So using it as that teaching moment of this is curated content versus if we're watching the news, it's still curated, but curated in a different way. There's a human curating it versus AI curating it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Emily, I would like to just add to what Laura mentioned, but I think in talking to your children, as parents, using giving them language to talk about, like giving them words so that they understand it, what they see on TV, and they can make sense of it and reinterpret it in a way that will make sense for them. So in other words, giving them access to words that's these conversations are normal. They can be heightened, and perhaps even teaching children, hey, if you feel uncomfortable with talking about this with another colleague or peer, maybe even creating some physical distance, right? Hey, time out. I need a break time, and or gaining some reinforcement from teachers to maybe support or mediate if things get a little, too overwhelming. So those are things that I consider, as a parent and talking to children is show them that, we are the standard to model before our children, what's appropriate dialogue and what's not.
That's a great point, Leon. And like being mindful of developmental stages and ages, right? Like how you talk to your 3 or 5-year-old is going to look very different than even a 10-year-old or your preteen or your tween, right? Like, so being kind of that awareness around like, where am I in my parenting stage and where is my child in their developmental stage? And what's appropriate to bring in and expose them to related to not only the election, but like we talked about earlier, the world events, right? Like there are a lot of really heavy world events happening right now. And so how do we engage in a dialogue about that as well? So we had a very interesting pre-submitted question related to when there is separation between parents and they hold different political beliefs. How do you help a child navigate in a situation where they're going back and forth between households that don't have shared political beliefs? And how would you help advise a client in that situation, whether it's the child or a parent navigating that sort of situation? Anyone want to jump in first? And maybe, actually, Leon, I'm going to have you maybe jump in first and just share a little bit about like recognizing the emotional triggers if you're the parent in that situation. Like how do we help support somebody first identifying those emotional triggers and then navigating that situation?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna say just name it. Acknowledge it, right? Label the feeling, label the trigger. Because I think one thing that we can tend to do as parents or even as adults is, right, we suppress and those particular emotions, or we don't have any just language around it. We don't know ourselves what we're experiencing. So I think it's important to name it. I also think it's important to stop, freeze in a moment, observe what's going on, um, externalize whatever the emotions are what's being created, and just to be curious about what's going on. You're not making any judgments about what you're feeling. I think this helps slow down your emotional brain, your amygdala, to be able to pause and freeze. So those are things that kind of come to mind.
Anything in the context of like how to talk to a child, getting different feedback from or belief systems from parents? Sorry, I'm totally putting you on the spot. Kaylin, jump in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the identification of like supporting kids to identify their values. I think even before like getting to a conversation about like what candidate mom or dad or parent might be interested in, is like, okay, what is important to you? Like what are things that you like to do? What are things that make you light up? What are things that make you sad? What are things that make you frightened? And helping especially some of the younger kids, I think language around likes, dislikes can be the groundwork for some of these bigger conversations. And I think working with teens, a lot of my conversation is around like, okay, now that we know these likes, these dislikes, let's connect that to values, and let's connect that to what you are seeing on the news and what you are seeing on social media and what you are digesting. I love the conversation around naming the thing and also being very explicit about our kids are seeing a lot, our teens are seeing a lot. And so having conversations with them about what they're experiencing, I think can often be important. Having time set aside to have those conversations.
Yeah, and I love that bridge between like what are you connecting to and what are you building in terms of your value system. And I think the parents can use that in that moment of having different political belief systems, right? That it's okay to have a different belief system like than I have as your mother or your father. And what is your own? Like giving them that permission to arrive in their own self, right? And their own belief system that can be separate from ours. What techniques or tools can someone use to create healthy separation and boundaries?
Yeah. We'll take a stab at this one. So I think what's important is to really explore and identify what is boundaries. That can be defined by a lot of different cultures, but generally boundaries are limitations that you're putting for yourself. I think Laura spoke to this. There are not consequences on others. It's not punishing others, but it's mainly to protect yourself, your well-being. I think of boundaries as like property lines, invisible property lines. This is your property, and you have the authority and choice to invite anybody over, that you would like. So who's there, how things happen. To me, that's when I think of boundaries, I think of that. So I don't know if there's necessarily a tool or technique, rather behaviors to implement to feel safe. But I think this is something I'll go back to is having a voice or words. What is it that I really believe? What are my values? What am I willing to talk about or willing to do? And what am I not willing to do? I think is a good, helpful guideline. Um, Talking about guidelines, establishing them. What are some rules for engagement when you're engaging in this discussion? How do you know when the discussion is no longer constructive? When should things terminate? I think those are important questions to ask. taking turns, right? There should be a listener and speaker so that both opinions and worldviews are being honored and acknowledged. Something that I like to, when I work with couples, that I like to say is, no interruptions. Try to understand your partner's perspective. And in this same vein, I think with elections, is go into the conversation with understanding what is the position and perception of that individual. And you don't have to agree with what they're saying, but the idea is to create some type of connection, some validation. Can I find some common ground with this individual? And if we can't come to some agreement, can we negotiate with a compromise? And so I think that gets often lost in the art of kind of negotiating or conflict. But I think it's really important that those rules get established ahead of time. And I think finally, be able to summarize one another's content, right? What is the emotions? What are the values that I'm hearing? What's the story behind? What is the dream or story behind what the individual is sharing? I think that can go a long way in dissipating any feuds or conflict.
Yeah, I agree, Leanne. And Leanne and I both do a lot of couples work. And I think one of the things I try to help couples understand, and I think it applies in this context too, there's a difference between agreeing and acknowledging. We can acknowledge when we don't agree with someone. We can still acknowledge that this is your perspective, this is your belief system. And I think a lot of people are always working towards agreement. Like it doesn't feel constructive unless there's agreement. So I think it's helpful to step back and recognize we don't have to agree in order to have a constructive, connected, I like that you use that word, conversation about this really heavy, hard topic. Laura, I'm curious if there are ways that you've identified when, like, how do you identify if constructive dialogue isn't possible? I'll throw it to you, Laura, but actually to all of you, like, how would you help support somebody in saying, like, actually, this is a time to really assert a boundary?
For sure. And I everything that has been said just like prior to this, I think really speaks to things that I was talking about before, and also thinking about like this idea of respecting someone's voice and actively listening, but also realizing that we don't have to agree. And I think that is really important work, and also really hard work, because like Emily just said, I think we always want to come to resolution. And as individuals, it can be hard to sit in no resolution. I think that is so hard. If we're the client, if we're whoever we are in this space and place and time, it's like, that's uncomfortable. That's uncomfortable. I don't know how to sit in that. Recognizing that that's okay. And I think that's part of that, the question that Emily just, asked is like being okay with being uncomfortable. That like the conversation itself might be uncomfortable, but that there might not be a resolution. It might not be wrapped up in a bow and we go, you know what, I see your side, and we're good. Like, and I love that Leon and Kaylin have been talking a lot about like the body and how we feel. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I know that clients have been like, I've been in screaming matches with a parent or an older sibling or even a younger sibling where they feel really remorseful and they're like, I love my family member and I'm so sad it got to this point, because the resolution was perhaps then a couple days later, or even in that process was, there's still the I love yous and a back and forth of I'm sorry, but they wish it hadn't gotten to that point. So what I think the question is, how do we not get to that point, right? And I think it really is this kind of physical feeling of when do we know, how do we know when to stop? And if it is this feeling of I just cannot participate, like I spoke to earlier, and stopping yourself, which again, emerging adults, it might be really hard to know if that's, what the feeling is taking a breath. It's almost, taking the remote control and pausing the situation and saying, loved one, I think we've gotten past the point of conversation and we're going into conflict. And I don't think there's going to be a healthy back and forth. And this is therapy talk. I don't think my client is going to say that. But in any way that they feel necessary, if it's just like, let's take a break, let's take a pause, it's really finding those boundaries. And I work so much with all of my clients about boundaries. It could be friends too. I think friends constantly are having just like, where I just don't want to talk about this anymore. We've been talking at length, even when they agree, right? It's like, oh my goodness, I can't talk about this anymore. It is making me sad. We've been discussing it for an hour and I need to stop. It's really heavy on my heart. And I think we both agree, and we're talking in a vacuum, in a bubble, and I agree with you, but it's a lot. And it's feeling it in your body and going,
Yeah.
I think I need to take a pause.
So what do you guys, because you're naming something really important, Laura, that I think I've been sitting with clients for months now, is like this like saturation point. And what kind of techniques do each of you share with clients around, okay, they've identified they're at their saturation point, now what? How do you help them navigate the now what? Like you just shared a great example, Laura, like naming it, putting that boundary around, because you're right, it can happen when we even share a belief system, right? It's like I'm at my limit, or I know just for myself, right? I share a political belief system with my mother and sister, and sometimes they want to share more articles that I'm like, I don't have bandwidth for this. I can't take anymore. And naming it. But what do we do? Like, how can we help support people when they've reached that saturation point and recognizing it? I've kind of heard throughout our conversation, right? Is like, can we take a social media break? What else have you guys advocated or recommended?
I
Kaylin.
love a good social media break, Emily. I recommend that quite often. And I think also just evaluating what our schedules look like, just in terms of like our day to day. I think
Mm,
we often can get trapped in absorbing so much information because some things are just on autopilot. Like we have the news on when we're driving to work. We might be listening to a podcast that's talking about things that are happening around the world. And I think it is important, one, yes, to acknowledge that, but I also think, as we talked about earlier, taking control of the things that we do have control over.
mhm.
And so I was talking to a friend the other day, and they were like, I just feels like I'm just talking about sadness all the time. Like I'm frustrated all the time. And we talked about like, what do you do that cultivates joy? What are your joy practices? What are things that you can go to that you know will lift your spirit? Who can you go to that will lift your spirit? I think as we're talking about, community is so important in these times. Being surrounded by folks who can love on you in the ways that you want to be loved on is incredibly important, and making sure that you know what it is that what tools and supports you have access to. And so I love also writing things down. I think when we get saturated and oversaturated, we can often forget the tools, the people that are at our fingertips that do love us. And so sometimes I do work with clients. I'm literally writing out a joy protocol of things that they can go to. So if you can post that up on your bathroom mirror or wherever, so that you're able to see and to recognize that you do have folks and you do have skills.
And I love that idea of writing it down because that's so grounding, right? Even if you don't
Yes.
actually use the list, to know the list exists and that it's sitting on your bathroom mirror can be grounding in and of itself. I love that, Kaylin. That's great.
The
Yeah.
ad I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Leanne. I was acknowledging you.
Those some good points you made. You mentioned familiarity with a voice or a person. I think that in those moments, finding that person that you can confide in, you can go to for support in that moment. I think nothing could be said about the buffer of social of a community,
Mhm.
to buffer from some of those maybe traumatic or triggering responses. But I'm gonna throw this one out. This may be non-traditional, but using humor around time,
Mhm.
like laugh it off.
Love it.
Humor has always that's something that I like to do. And I find that it's really helpful. It really calms and soothes, and it helps you transition from those states that I was mentioning to you earlier. But humor is really healing. In addition to that, but crafting or customizing a self-care menu. I often utilize this a lot with clients with specific strategies already in place, right? Activities, routines that they immediately can access to. whether that's physical, emotional, and spiritual, cognitive, to address those specific, triggers.
I love calling it a menu too. That sounds so lovely. I'd like a menu of self-care. I think the other one I often suggest too is like get outside, get in nature. Like we have a lot of research showing how much being in green spaces can reduce anxiety, can reduce depression symptoms. It often is coupled with movement, right? And so just like go take a walk. Even if you only have like 20 minutes at work for a lunch break, go walk around your building. Just go breathe some outside air and see if that helps calm you down too. I would love to move into some of the questions that we've received. And one of these feels really adjacent to what we're talking about. Somebody asked, they'd like to know how to prepare for unusual events in the news and in our communities as the election season progresses. How would you respond to that person, or what kind of guidance would you provide that person?
I think as I was speaking earlier about like uncertainty, I think one, acknowledging that there's going to be a lot of that in this time,
Mhm.
can be helpful in kind of releasing control over the outcome. You can control you can control how you vote, how you make other decisions in your life, but we don't know what's going to happen. And then I think from there, using some of the strategies that we're talking around the self-care menu, a joy protocol, um, cultivating things that are going to help you feel in control over the things that you can feel control over. And then, as you mentioned earlier, Emily, like engaging in other ways. Like, do I go out and join a protest? Do I go out and write an article? Do I go out and like write a letter to my elected official? Doing things that can help us feel more secure, but knowing that at the end of the day, we don't have a control over a whole lot.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's a helpful frame of like recognizing what you do have control over, the ways you can engage with that and what you don't. Anyone else have any guidance around that?
I just want to piggyback off of that. I think the just the idea of what we do have control over and what we don't have control over. I have a lot of clients who, if it is an event that is unusual, when routine is really just, kind of thrown off course, how do we maybe get back onto routine, or just like, okay, this might change your routine. What does that look like? I know routine and it changing can feel really disorienting and feel really dysregulating for folks. And how do we kind of get back on track? And also, again, what can we control? I love the idea, my father is 78 and he every Thursday makes calls for elected officials. This idea of how can what is within our fingertips, what can we control? And of course, there's going to be things that are out of our control. And there are going to be clients who the rigidity and the feelings and all of it is just feels like it's too much. And I love a menu. And if the routine is, ooh, it's thrown a little bit off course, do we find a new course? Do we alter? Do we look in different ways? And what's within our control? I know that can feel so dysregulating for folks. And how do we reframe sometimes? Or maybe we just have to get back on course and it was a day or two or week, but what does it look like?
Oh, we've got a couple other great ones coming in. Um, So I'm going to go through a couple of these, but I'm going to first ask, please address responses for those with significant trauma backgrounds. I know this is coming up for a lot of clinicians at the Family Institute. And Leon, maybe you could take this one as a member of our trauma team. Like, how do you help people specifically who have trauma backgrounds and their traumas getting activated or triggered during the election cycle?
We're definitely doing some somatic body work, as mentioned. But I would say I guess practically, I think it's just being aware of your window of tolerance, right? There's an optimal zone where we can process information, we can problem solve, we can interact and engage, right? That's kind of the rational brain there. But I think I think for those who have significant trauma backgrounds, it may be helpful to make a choice. Maybe this season I don't have the bandwidth, the emotional tolerance, so I'm going to step aside and I'm going to maybe uh, institute some boundaries around those who I know around me perhaps may want to assert or assume some of their positions or values. I think it's very helpful just to acknowledge I have to step away because I just don't have the emotional capacity, or I need a timeout, or I need a break. And like mentioned earlier, or if I am going to engage with high stake election conversations, I just need somebody else to mediate. I need another support system in place. Not only that, but if you are to continue to engage, set the tone. Where is this going to happen? In other words, initiate the environment, secure the space so that you feel comfortable to be able to assert maybe some of your political preferences or views. And like I said before, use physical distance, because someone from a traumatic background often has been exploited or taken advantage of, not just emotionally but even in their body, and we want to be able to restore a sense of control and power to that particular individual. And so that a lot of that just means giving them the autonomy and the choice to whether they're going to lean in or lean out. Are they decide they're going to participate or not? Another thing is, in that season, maybe just avoid any of the other exposures to triggers that you are just well aware of. Again, this doesn't have to be indefinitely, but perhaps maybe for a season until you've developed emotional tolerance skills and emotional affect regulation skills. This just may be a space where you time out just for the season.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the recognition of the physical safety, right? And the violations that have happened with physical space, and like, how can I take back some agency and autonomy in how I protect my physical space? That's really beautiful. Yeah. So we got two questions that are kind of variations of each other. So I'm going to try to synthesize them. But it's related to the election and politics being so increasingly polarized. And one was asking how to help people struggling with a sense of hopelessness. But the other one was, how do we maintain or cultivate a sense of optimism and hope for the future? And so, part of me is inclined to lean into the hope for the future part of the question, right? But I think it is this like dichotomy of how do we, in the polarized political climate, there is this polarization of hope. And like, what would you say on both ends, both to the person struggling with a sense of hopelessness, but also how to help people? And I think we spoke to this a little bit. Kaylin's joy inventory to me speaks to hope, right? Like taking that inventory, what makes me feel joyful, in my opinion, connects with hope. What are your guys' thoughts about this? Because I do think this is what people are struggling with.
I've had someone conceptualize it to me. They went to a talk with Angela Davis, who conceptualizes like voting and election season as harm reduction. Noting that no matter who is in office, no matter who is making these policies, that again, going back to control, that it is up to us as individuals, as a collective, to be making the world that we want to see. And so whether again that is engaging in things that light us up or that bring us joy, or whether that is engaging with some of these different political structures, there is both a lot that we can control and some uncertainty, but I think leaning into that part of what we can control, like the world will continue, the sun will rise the next day after the election, and it's up to us to continue to make those changes and to make the practices that are important to us and that make the community and those around us feel loved and cared for.
Yeah, I love that, kind of the roots spreading of hope.
I love.
Go ahead, Laura.
Oh, thank you, Lan. I love that. I think that it is, no matter what the outcome is, we see an outpour of, like a grassroots kind of community organizing, people coming together to be like, okay, well, I don't feel satisfied, and there is hope, right? Like, I think I talked the other day when we were all speaking that, like, yes, the general and presidential election is enormous, and not to be like it isn't, but we have the mayoral elections, the senators, and so many other elections where we can use our voices, and not to, tell a client or a friend or someone else like, well, there's, this is going to happen. And there are these glimmers of hope, right? There are things that we can do again that are within our control. I mean, we saw it happen time and time again of people coming together and banding together. And I don't know, that gives me hope when you see those images of people just like, I mean, it's really a beautiful thing when you see people come together for a cause, whatever it might be, to create hope. People are creating it when there's an absence of it. It is a beautiful thing, especially when you see the younger folks being like, no, I'm not satisfied, and I want to change. And the hope being created out of that is really something.
Yeah, that is a beautiful way to capture it and name it, because I do think a lot of our younger generation is leaning into like, we want change and we're going to drive it. We're not going to wait for somebody else to do it. So we're going to do it. And that elicits a lot of hope in me, for sure. How do you guys recommend, or what would you recommend is the best way to navigate political disagreements, particularly in a workplace or within friendship groups? And I think maybe the response is, at least for me, very different, right? Like, work should have a specific boundary. You can keep more of your authentic self a little veiled in a workspace. And it goes back to that, how you shared earlier, Kaylin, like, what is the purpose of this conversation? Like, what would the purpose of talking about your own personal belief system and politics at work be? Because there's a great high level of harm that could come from that. That feels a little different than maybe friends. Like, friends is that, to me, is more of that leaning into this, like, we can acknowledge each other's perspectives without having to agree with each other. What are your guys' thoughts about some of the complexities of disagreements in work or friendship?
I can speak just a little bit on more of the friendship dynamic. And I don't know if this is really an answer, but it's more of evaluating what you just mentioned, evaluating what are the intentions of this conversation, and what are the potential consequences if we engage in this conversation. Can this rupture a relationship that we have? So are my values, are they, can they create dissension and conflict, or can I just communicate my values with my friend, and just stating out loud, hey, this is kind of my background, this is what I believe in, and can we have a constructive dialogue about this? And again, what we had been mentioned already, setting up those rules of engagement so that there is space for common ground and constructive interactive dialogue that could occur. But again, I think what my colleagues had already said, but what are my needs in this conversation? What is my purpose? And at the end of the day, this election cycle will pass, right? As Kayla had already mentioned, but my friendships are going to remain. And so I have to make those considerations. Elections are every so often, every couple of years, right? But my friendships, maybe I've had a friendship for years. So do I want to spoil those things?
Great point.
I also think there's a level of like, we are here at the Family Institute. We are wanting relationships to persevere, and that is like the work that we do. And I also think that there are times when relationships are harmful to us, and there are times when relationships can't be preserved. And I think oftentimes the election is like when these conversations come up, but I would also encourage folks to, as Leon is stating, like, to think about the duration of the friendship, to think about like the consistency of that. Have your values been aligning the whole time? Are there things that have been working the whole time? Great. if there are things that maybe haven't been working and things that have been harmful to you, perhaps that is a separate conversation. But I do just want to acknowledge that yes, we are here for the preservation of relationships, but also it is okay if some relationships don't continue on.
Mhm.
Really important point, Kaylin. I really value you sharing that. That feels like a good space and good reminder for people, right? Is this relationship really working for me? And again, as a couples clinician, particularly when I'm meeting with couples in that discerning, are we going to stay together or not stage, I often remind them that I don't view the only good, quote unquote, good outcome of couples therapy as being staying together. It's really that, like, do you feel grounded in your sense of self? Is this the most adaptive relationship? And this could be like you're naming an opportunity to have that inventory of, like, are our values actually aligned? Is there reciprocity in this relationship? What's my felt experience? What do I feel in my body when I'm interacting with this friend or this person? See if we've got any additional questions. I feel like that is really all of our questions for today. Any final thoughts from any of you before we wrap up? Well, I really appreciate the three of you joining me this. Oh, go ahead, Laura.
I was just going to say the same sentiment, Emily. I mean, that I appreciate the dialogue and the space and the conversation. I know this can be hard. We're coming or nearing, election day, and these conversations don't end. I think that, Kaylin and Leon just talked about it, especially, friends and any circles, that this is the heightened state. This is the real heightened state, and that these conversations don't end. And I appreciate the space to have it now. And then hopefully we can take some of the stuff I've definitely learned from my colleagues today. So I appreciate that. And I just wanted to say thank you.
Yes, yeah, definitely. This has been such a great learning opportunity for me as well. And I couldn't agree more that a lot of what we talked about today was anchored in the election, but is much larger than the election. As Kaylin mentioned, we are a relational organization. And so a lot of what we talked about in terms of boundary setting and identifying emotional triggers within ourselves has legs that go well beyond having conversations about the election season. So I really value each of you taking the time to join me today. And I did want to share that the Family Institute has online scheduling available through our website. I'm fairly certain all four of us are currently also accepting new clients. So you can seek us out, but we have lots of other team members who would love to provide support throughout not just the election cycle, but at any point through anyone's journey. And we're just so glad people were able to make the time to join us today. Thank you, everyone.